Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be talking about one of the more difficult aspects of your work, whether you're working with young children or adults. One area that everyone, even professional writers, can improve on is their writing skills. Now, I've also done some other videos, or even throughout these videos I talk a lot about reading skills. So I thought I'd do a video on writing skills because I think it deserves a little bit of targeted attention, because it is an area where even if you talk to literacy specialists or English teachers and say, how can you improve students' writing skills? You'll get a whole different array of answers depending on who you're talking to. And quite often, even the, experts, as you call them, will trip over themselves trying to figure out how to give you a simple answer for how to improve students' writing skills. Now, the first thing I will say is that there is a strong association between writing skills and reading skills. So if students are quite good at reading, they're avid readers, or they have a high level of reading ability, or even if they just enjoy reading, then their writing skills are going to usually match what their reading skills are. Now that's not always the case, obviously, but generally speaking, and this is borne out in some research that I've been reading recently, there is a strong correlation between different types of skills. One of them is between reading and writing, and I think the correlation is, it's not quite a perfect correlation, but it's pretty close to it. There are also strong links between other subjects, like obviously maths and science and things, and surprisingly what that research did show is there is a strong link between reading and writing skills and subjects you wouldn't normally associate with those particular areas, such as science and maths, that would seem like dichotomies, I guess, or opposites, two different sides of the coin, but there is an association there. So one little trick, I guess you could call it a trick, or one thing that I think comes from that research is that if there is such a perfect correlation between reading skills and writing skills, and by the way, I've done quite a few different videos on different types of reading and how to approach reading in different ways, such as active reading, so please watch that one. It's only a short video, but it is a really important part of the reading process, teaching and learning process anyway. But so the point is, if there is a strong correlation between writing skills and reading skills, then logically then if you have a student who enjoys reading or would much prefer doing reading as opposed to writing, then because there is that correlation, if they did more reading, which would be easier to get them to do at home, to get parents involved, to get the student reading for longer periods of time and things like that, then that is going to affect their writing skills anyway. So my personal opinion, or my personal thoughts, is there is a lot of opportunity there to use those correlations to be able to develop reading and writing programs, or even just writing programs with a bit of active reading and just pure exposure as well. Sometimes just that rote, repetitive exposure is a really good strategy as far as either writing's concerned or reading. So I guess that's a backdoor way into improving people's writing skills, is to do a lot of reading of various different types. So just have a think about that. You might need to do some experiments to see if it works. I don't know if it's going to work with every single student, but certainly that's what the research is sort of pointing us to anyway. Now, I just wanted to go through a couple of different things. Phonics and whole word. Whole word. And while I'm up there, I'll just put one more. Okay, so generally with writing skills in the early childhood type phase, there are two really important areas, and this applies to reading as well, not just writing. Obviously, again, there is that strong correlation there. I've added up the mathematical version of that as well, because I just like to always tuck that into the corner of these types of conversations, because I think it's important and it's it's lesser known, I guess. So phonics is the name, I guess, of a strategy or a way of delivering a way of helping students to improve their awareness of sounds and how to sound things out and how sounds work and how sounds combine and those types of things. I've done a different video on phonics, so have a watch of that. I won't spend too much time explaining it, but basically you've just got sounds like that, little sounds, and they obviously can be pronounced differently depending on if they're combined with each other or individual. There are silent sounds and so on and so forth. Phonics is one of those areas where it does scare a lot of people because there is a lot of jargon that goes into that particular area. There's a lot of linguistics and so on, but I think you can by and large ignore a lot of it and just remember that phonics is sounds, and I try not to use any of that type of jargon unless I really have to. There's no such thing as advanced phonics or anything like that. Just remember that it just simply means sounds, and all you're doing is teaching kids sounds or people who are learning a second language and so on and so forth. Now, quite often when students have problems with their writing skills or their reading, well, not quite often, the very first thing you should do, whether you're teaching adults or working in the corporate sector or training sector or high school kids, whatever, the first thing and the most important thing to do is to always think about the basics of the language and the basic building blocks of the language, which is phonics, and just to make sure that students understand all of those sounds. And it may seem really stupid to take, say, a year 9 student to go back and to go through all the different letters and sounds and so on. But I think that's a really important process, and it may only take 10 minutes. It may take half an hour, but that would be my first go-to step if students are having problems with either their writing skills or their reading skills. So don't be surprised if you do notice that there are some sounds that students don't understand or don't recognize straight away, because that can cause issues, not so much in the writing maybe, but in the reading. So anyway, looking at phonics, watch that video. Phonics is something that students or teachers concentrate on, or both students and teachers concentrate on quite a lot in the early years. And in fact, the reason for that is because if you don't get phonics right, then it really makes it difficult afterwards to go on to do those next stages. So in this particular lesson here, I'll go through and I'll show you the basics here, and then we'll move all the way through to teaching adults or teaching year 11s or 12s. So that's the basics of phonics. Just remember that it's sounds, and there are various different ways to teach sounds. There are lots of different ways. So one way you can do it is, and the most common is just by pure repetition. Normally it starts by introducing simple sounds, A, B, C, that type of thing, and then it moves on to more sounds that have like 2 letters, like the T and the H and the S and the H, and so on and so forth. And there's different terms for these that I'm not going to go through now because I don't want to scare anyone. But just remember that if you, like anything in education, you start really simple and then you move down to something that's a slightly more advanced and so on and so forth. And there's only a certain number of sounds in English anyway, so it's not like this is a never-ending thing. Again, watch my video on phonics. It's very easy to learn pretty much everything you need to know about phonics in a 10-20 minute video. I don't think there's anything special about it. There's it's super important for sure, and there's lots of different things and ways in which you can go about teaching phonics, but generally it's all about exposure and practice at that level. So it's just being able to use those sounds individually, whether that's playing games, whether that's on little flip cards and things like that, and you'll see around classrooms, teachers hang up the alphabet will run across the top of the whiteboard and so on. So that's just pure exposure and repetition. There might even be a little bit of rote learning in there as well, because rote learning, which is just that surface learning memorization, but that can actually be a precursor for it being able to be conceptualized and understood at a more deeper level. So that's the basics of phonics, and it is the first and most important step when you're going through and thinking about any type of reading, writing, or language acquisition type thing. So if you don't understand that, then you're really going to, or students are really going to struggle thereafter. Okay, now the next step and this is a bit of a contentious issue in the education world. Some experts say that you should teach phonics first and then move into something of a whole, what is called a whole word type strategy. And what that means is that you're teaching sight words. So a sight word or sight words. So a sight, I suppose I'll put the word up there. A sight word is simply a word like the or cat. Any of those, it can be small words, they can be bigger words, and they're usually the words that are used quite regularly in every sentence. And so if you take the word the, for example, students shouldn't need to be able to sound that out using some type of phonics. So they shouldn't go the like that. What we really want them to say is the straight away. And by a sight word, it means they see the word almost like it's an object. So almost like you see a whiteboard marker, or you see a whiteboard, or you see a person or a tie or whatever, and you just see it as a single object. So that's probably the best way I can explain what a sight word is. Now that generally, I call that whole word learning. And that means that the student is moving away from phonics, although sometimes there is that bit of that transitional phase depending on the student's abilities, and quite often they'll use a little bit of whole word and a little bit of phonics at the same time. Sight words are normally considered to be really basic words, so even though these are the same thing, generally when we talk about sight words, we're talking about really simple words, the student's name, basic nouns, and things like that. Whole words are more so considered to be, let's say we have a sentence like, I'm just making this up. Let's say the dog ran to the car and was happy. Okay, so these are pretty much all sight words where over time we'll want the student to not have to sound out these words because they're all very simple words and just be able to look at it almost like it's a block. So that's the best way to explain that. Now, whole word learning is where it's another way of going about teaching students where, again, there's less of an emphasis on phonics and more of an emphasis on just learning these, I guess you could call them chunks of information. So that's just another thing to bear in mind. My preference is to always do phonics first and start with the basics, and then once you've got a really good grasp of that, moving to whole word, bearing in mind that you will be using a lot of authentic text as you go through that process. So you probably won't be using too many authentic texts at this stage, actually, cancel that. By whole word, you will also be integrating their phonics into words that are in real sentences that make sense to students. So what that means is there'll be some short stories or even the simple kids' picture books that have a single sentence at the bottom and so on and so forth. So opportunities to practice with all of these is really important. But point is, starting with phonics, moving into whole word by taking advantage of how our brains naturally start using sight words to see a word and be able to pronounce it straight away and to recognise it straight away. Now, these whole words, by the way, or these sight words here, they're what we call high utility words, or I like to call them high utility words. So they're used quite often. There's a few other different terms that people use. Now, generally speaking, there are something in the realm of, I think the top 200 or so words that people use, particularly children, represent some huge portion of words. You can Google this. It's something like 70% or something. I can't remember. And then the top 500 represent 98% of words in sentences for most children, I think it is. So that's where these sight words and the high utility words come in handy, because I might actually just write that as a separate thing. High utility words. So, and let's just say the top 500. Now, 500 may seem like a lot, and you're not going to teach students that in year one, but you could imagine that if students knew those top 500 words, and there's plenty of lists, you can go online and look these up. top 200, top 300, etc., etc. So if you look up those top 500 words and help students to learn those top 500 over a period of time, or at least a portion of them, then two things happen. One, they're starting to be exposed to and understand the ways in which those words look when they're in their most simple form, as well as when you're adding plurals on them and hyphens and things like that. So, and there's a good chance that they're going to come up more regularly. And if they're coming up more regularly, then they've got more of a chance just to practice them while they're watching cartoons at home or playing video games or talking to friends or whatever. So once they start using those words in their day-to-day language, or quite often they already are, and then you start showing them how to write it, how they work in sentences and so forth, and that's only going to serve to further consolidate their knowledge in that particular area. Because sometimes what happens if students are having problems with either reading or writing is they have gaps in that top 500 there. And I like to do, when I'm teaching things or developing programs or whatever, I like to do things in very structured ways. So for me, to be able to test and diagnose and make sure that there's no gaps there, I find that that's a really good way about going about that process of ensuring that students have definitely achieved this level before they can move on to the next level. And by the way, those high utility words, if you've ever been involved in any reading program at school, and in these videos I talk a lot about reading programs, because I think particularly for teacher aides, it's something that everyone is involved with to some extent. That's their full-time sort of job. And you'll notice that most reading programs have a level system. Regardless of how much neuroscience and other mumbo jumbo they advertise, they're all pretty much the same. They all just use high utility words and certain types of grammatical structures, or such as full stops, commas or whatever. They'll introduce them at different points. So literally someone will sit down and go, well, here we're going to try to only use the top 50 or 70 words or whatever. Here we're going to try and use the top 200. Here we're going to try and use the top 300. And we're going to use full stops and commas here. And here we might add in, I don't know, something else like a quotation mark. And maybe they'll add in some plurals here and so on. So that's a very simplistic way of thinking about it. And if you're ever looking at making a kid's book, which I've never done, but I would imagine that having some different, thinking about the different level and the types of words that you used, those high utility words are a really good way to go about it. Just as a side note, there are some really common spelling tests out there used, such as, it used to be called the South Australian Australian something or other. You might have to just type in spelling test there. And that was a test that was given to kids pretty much all over Australia that went through, and it didn't quite do the top 500 words because it was more so for, say, high school kids or whatever, but it did go through and you were able to use it to score where they were at. Starting with real simple words like, I haven't done this in 10 years, but from no, not quite that simple. Real simple words like, 3-letter words, 4-letter words, right up to words like miscellaneous and cemetery and things like that people quite commonly get wrong. So that's the way of doing, say, level 1 through to, and I'm just making these levels up now, level 10. There was a few words from that one, a few words from that one, a few words from that one, and so on. I'm being a bit generalistic here. I'm generalising and simplifying how they've done it, but effectively that's what they have done. And I would say that if there was 10 levels, and I think from memory there was 100 spelling questions, 100 sounds like a lot. There was a lot of words in it anyway, so they would have a certain number of words for each one, and that gave you the ability to then figure out specifically what level they were at. They had their own system. Where's my marker? They had their own system, as everyone does. Everyone invents their own system, which you can go about doing yourself because, again, there's no magic involved with any of these things. Now, I'm just going to have to rub that off. There are a whole bunch of reasons or a whole bunch of things that people do correct when they are good spellers, good writers, good at grammar, that type of stuff. So from my perspective, I like to call them effective, or what I like to call is effective, I'm going to call them effective spellers. I'll call them effective spellers, but this actually applies to grammar, to reading, to writing, and so on and so forth. But we'll just, and when I say writing, I mean being able to put sentences together, string sentences together, and to be able to articulate in words what you actually want to say, or what most closely resembles what you want to say using the vocab that person has available. Because quite often there's a difference between our oral vocab and the way in which we explain things verbally and the way in which we then write it. And even with adults, so in some of the assessments that we do, we train mainly teacher aides, and they can explain it to us verbally. They know the answer, no problems, but coming to the point of writing it on paper is where some students struggle, particularly early on in their courses, because the reason is that we talk in a certain way, but there are lots of different genres. We generally talk in the same sort of way, regardless of who we're talking to, but there are lots of different genres for which we can write. So effective spellers, and again, that means reading, writing, whatever, anything to do with language. And the reason I do this, just one little step before that, the reason I do this is because I think to get students good at writing, one way to do that is to look at what do effective writers actually do. So what do effective spellers do? If we're trying to improve the spelling skills of students, which is something that we concentrate on particularly in about year 3 to year 6 type of thing, what do we do, and what do people who are really good at that, what do they actually go about doing? So there is a few different things. Strategies. Now they use a whole bunch of different strategies. They know the rules, which is sort of like generalizations. I'll go through these in a sec. Oop, my pen is running out. Memory aids is another one. I am going to chuck in a big word. Orthographic system, self-monitoring. Exposure. Whoops. Okay. So here's just a few. So I'm going to start at the reverse. As we were saying before, people who are really good at reading and writing, they generally have a huge amount of exposure. So what that means for us as teachers, teacher aides, is that we can then expose those students. We can use that as a strategy when we're going about teaching reading and writing. And what that basically means is that students are being given the opportunity to practice on a regular basis. So there is one, let me write some strategies, and as they come to me, we'll write them up the side here. So also the first one we're talking about over here is strategies. So one of them is writing to learn. So that basically just means that a student and how that works in the real world is, or in a classroom is, students will come in for the first 6 minutes, they can just write about anything they want. So it's almost like a stream of consciousness writing, although stream of consciousness writing is actually quite difficult. It's actually not that easy for students to do. Writing to learn means that they're coming in, sitting down, the teacher might put a topic on the board or a question or something like that, and they can go through and just write about that topic, write anything that they actually would like to do. And that's similar to free writing. Free writing is just where students can literally choose their own topic, write about their weekend or whatever. I've found in the past doing these things that if you do let students write about whatever they want to, they really struggle with that. So you're best to give them 3 different options and some type of structure around it. The important thing with these strategies, which is all about exposure, right? Oh, I've already written exposure. I've already written exposure. So we're going to call it multiple exposures, which I'll get to in a sec because that's something slightly different. So the thing with all of these strategies is that it is all about exposure. So it's about rote learning, rote/repetition, which is almost an evil word in education circles because this is sort of associated with the old school traditional way of teaching. But I think, and I've got a video on traditional teaching methods, I think there's a lot we still do a lot of this anyway, but we call it various different things to try and hide the fact that that effectively we're teaching in the same way we did 100 or so years ago. So I think there's a lot of good things that we that can come from that rote and repetition. So that's what you get there. Now, the big thing about this is making sure that you're not actually marking students on their writing skills. The idea is it's just practice, pure practice. So that's another one called deliberate practice. Now, they can, of course, practice on a certain thing. So they're actively trying to practice their sentence structure or whatever. But the important thing is that it is not assessed in any way whatsoever. So you really don't even want to provide a comment. I think best practice would be to literally not comment at all, not comment on that it's messy, not comment on the volume that they've done, not comment on sentence structure, nothing, because then they're going to start writing to the test, as they say, or writing to the assessment, and they're going to less so just freely write and just let the and sort of practice without that stress and start writing knowing that this is going to be assessed and looked at by my teacher. So I'd just be very careful about that. It's an important concept as part of that writing to learn process. And again, I'm going to do a little video on that sometime soon because it's a really important strategy for almost all grades, just to get people writing for the sake of writing, not worrying about their learning. Not worrying about their writing skills in any way. So that improves not only their writing, but it also improves their knowledge on a certain topic. It helps consolidate it, it helps revise it. Think of it almost like journal writing. And kids absolutely love doing that writing to learn process as well. 6 or 7 minutes, just write. Okay, so multiple exposures means they get multiple opportunities to be exposed to a wide range of different texts. I said authentic text before, but we'll get back to that. But multiple exposures means if you're going to teach phonics or say, any of those sight words, then students need to be able to see those sight words on a regular basis. So once or twice a week, 3 times a week, constantly exposed. That doesn't mean that they're rote learning it or that they're memorizing it or anything like that, although that can be a good way to at least develop a baseline level of information in their brain, so that hopefully then through practice and repetition and multiple exposures, that short-term memory moves across to long-term memory. So that's called spaced practice, by the way, and I have another video on that. So it's exposures over a period of time, and during that video I explain how physically the brain works, so that you take that information from short-term memory and put it into long-term memory in different ways that as teachers or teacher aides or education professionals we can help facilitate that process. So that's multiple exposures. Rote and repetition is quite simple. Look, cover, write, check, for example. Look, cover, write, check. That's still done through schools all over the place, particularly in upper primary school, and is quite effective, again, to get that baseline. Deliberate practice, which I've got a video about, so watch that one. Using authentic texts. As students go on, you want to start using more and more texts that are relevant to what they're doing outside of school. So they might be reading blogs or whatever. So that they've got some context to be able to see and understand those words and the sentences and so forth. So if you ever tried learning a second language, just memorizing words doesn't really get you very far. It can be a useful strategy as part of a wider strategy, but you really do need to see those words on street signs or on TV and in conversation and so on and so forth. And that really helps consolidate that knowledge in your own mind. So as students go through the years, we try and use more and more authentic texts. And that generally refers to texts that are, by authentic, we mean real world. So they're not created specifically for educational purposes. And again, a bit of a spectrum there, because some textbooks these days have anecdotes in them and newspaper clippings and things like that. Things from magazines or whatever, but I guess it depends what your definition is. But as a concept, the use of authentic text where possible is really important, and spaced practice, which we've already gone through there. So basically, effective spellers, we've gone through exposure. Yeah, and now we're up to basically strategies, which we've started talking about here. And there's a ton of other strategies out there for writing skills and for reading skills. So chunking is another one that I was going to talk about. So that's just another way of dividing words, sentences, paragraphs, or larger text into smaller different parts. That's a very important skill to have. There's retelling, repeated reading, and I've done videos on all of these, so watch them. So the difference is retell is sort of like a verbal summary of a text. So if they're writing something, students can then retell it instead of reading it out word for word. And that helps them look at and identify the gaps in the way they've described things and so on. Or they can retell something that they've watched or something that they've seen or whatever. Or something, well, that's the same thing, isn't it? Or something that they've read. Repeated reading. Repeated reading is a very effective strategy for writing and for reading skills because... and repeated reading, you can also have repeated writing, which isn't a thing, but that's what I call it. So you can have repeated writing, which is the same as repeated reading because that's super effective. Now, what that basically means is that you're doing some type of repetitious work. Usually that is a paragraph or so and the student is just reading over that paragraph over and over again, 3, 4, 5, 7 times. Maybe not 7, until they get it perfect, and then maybe doing the same thing the next day. And that way, especially if you're using those high utility words, those high use words, students just get that repetitive practice until they absolutely master it without the ums and ahs and all that kind of thing. So that's called repeated reading. Repeated writing can also work in a similar fashion, that you're getting students to write out sentences and describe things in different ways and so on and so forth. So that's strategies. As you can see, there's a whole ton of them that can be used and that you can teach them to students as well. So when they're going through and practicing, not practicing, but as they're going through that learning process, they're able to use chunking, they're able to practice rote and repetition, writing words out 3 times. They're getting multiple exposures. Another sort of strategy that I haven't put here is seeking assistance. That's the most obvious one. I talk a lot about metacognitive skills as well. But either way, and all of these are kind of strategies too, in a sense. So generalization. So students who can spell really well are quite happy to have a guess, and they'll not only will they learn the different rules, so they'll know the different rules and what is known as the orthographic system, which is basically the way in which the language comes together in your the rules of that particular language type of thing. So, I mean, that's a big word. Don't be too concerned about that. But basically, yeah, you're learning the different rules and aspects of the actual system. I kind of duplicated myself there a little bit. But they're also just learning the generalizations. And you'll see this is where kids will make a lot of mistakes, but that's also a good thing because they're taking things like putting S's on the end of things if they want to make them plural when they don't really belong there and things like that, or spelling things in certain ways where they don't want them to, you can see how it relates to other similar words that they've been learning but isn't quite right. So those generalizations, in this case we're talking about spelling specifically, so teaching kids not only those phonics, but what happens if you plurify a word, I don't even. So you make plural a word. So if you've got a word like company and you want to make that plural, there's 2 ways you can do it, right? So you can, that's not how you spell that. Company, yeah, that's better. So there are 2 ways that you can do that. Obviously you can put the S on the end, or you can do an IES and then drop the Y, and you've got the possessive on either side of that S, depending on whether you're talking about one company or multiple companies. So the example I usually use for that as well is this one. Dog's bone. Sorry, this isn't talking about the plural, but this is talking about the apostrophe if you're teaching this to high school kids or whatever. And this is one that even most adults get wrong, but it's really simple. And I think that's because a lot of teachers, even English teachers, and I'm an English teacher, don't really quite understand. So you can put your apostrophe here, right? And what does that mean? Quite simple. That means that it is a dog's bone. So a single dog, the bone is owned by a single dog. And then if you put it there, that obviously means that there are multiple dogs. So that bone is owned by 2 or more dogs. So that's all that means. It's quite simple. So it's just there to explain to the reader what you're referring to. The only exception to that rule, by the way, just quickly, is if you've got something like this. Women's store. Yeah. So in this case, because that is already plural, so women already means 2 or more, you don't need to put it here to show that it's plural. But anyway, that's by the by. It's just a very simple one. There's a lot of simple rules, I guess, that are very easy to learn that people commonly get wrong. And it's I see that mistake being made even on signs for businesses and things like that on TV. You sometimes quite often see that mistake on breaking news down the bottom and whatnot. So, and for those that do know it, it's something that you will see quite regularly. But it's very easy to learn and very easy to teach kids. Probably not young kids like year 3 or anything. But so point is that they learn those generalizations that if you put an S on the end and maybe an apostrophe, and then even if they're using that apostrophe wrong in, say, middle primary or whatever, then it doesn't really matter. They've learnt the generalization that an apostrophe is used somewhere around at the end generally to specify that this noun is owned by the subject of that sentence, so the dog or the women. Okay, so effective spellers, they know a bunch of strategies such as these different things, such as dividing words down, such as sounding words out, such as seeking help. Other strategies, so you've got, let's write some out. And this is what you can teach them, right? So seeking help, cues, and cues are like clues. So that's C-U-E-S. Cues are like I just think of them like clues, C-L-U-E-S. So clues are like cues, looking at the image, looking at the other words in the sentence, having a guess, all this kind of stuff. So I'm just going to put that there. Guess, chunking. I swear to God, I haven't had any alcohol, but I'm writing like a drunk elephant. What did I just say? Chunking. Chunking is another one. Obviously, there's generalizations and using a bunch of memory aids. So that one I just did then with the dog's bone, that's the one that I always remember. So if I come across a piece of writing and or I have to write something and it's a little bit confusing about where to put that apostrophe, especially if it's like a Latin word or something weird like that, then I always just refer back to that dog's bone. So I've got this general rule. So that's more of a rule, but it's also kind of a memory aid. Another one that I always use is this one for principal. And actually, one of my colleagues told me this one a couple of years ago because I used to always spell this wrong. Well, not always wrong, but I guess I used to just sort of guess. There's principal, the person in a school who runs a school, is your pal, P-A-L. So that's I always say that now whenever I have to write that word out. Not that it's something you write out all the time, but again, that's a little memory aid. So you can teach students those little memory aids as you go. And it does help. You do remember them. I think you quite often do remember them. Okay, cool. Obviously, there's the system of rules and that kind of stuff, word orders and things. That's important as well because if you're teaching students of a second language, they will use a different word order. So in a lot of the Asian languages, for example, the order of the sentence goes in a different way. So in Indonesian, in English we say blue chair. But in a lot of other languages, that noun goes first and the adjective goes after it. So it ends up being chair blue, like that. So literally it'll be the word for chair and then the word blue will go after it. Anyway, so that's the basics of what effective spellers do and the different ways in which you can help people to become effective spellers. And of course, all the different types of strategies that can be used. And I've done 50 odd videos on different teaching strategies. They all apply to reading and writing. So watch those. And I've got one video specifically that goes through language and literacy strategies. So that's more so for older kids, I guess, and it moves away from phonics a little bit. But you can see how we're basically doing, say, little space down here. You can see how we're basically doing phonics, and then from phonics, we're moving into whole word. And then from that, we're moving into these more general, so if that's whole word, we're moving more into sort of a text creation type area. And there, I guess, the three different stages. But with there, that's where the effective spellers type thing comes in handy, and all the different teaching strategies. And obviously here, we're still learning different words. I mean, I'm still learning different words all the time. So, there is a bit of a transition, but students typically, I guess, move through those different stages. Of course, some of those, that is combined in many respects. So you'll start with that, and then there's a bit of an overlap or transition as they move across to here. And just bearing in mind, as I was saying before, to make sure that they have that down pat, and they have that down pat, especially for high utility words, before you're moving on and trying to get them to either create a text or text creation, or then after that, actually, I would argue there's probably one more, so there's a fourth step, and that's your critical literacy type step. So that's, you go through text creation, say upper high school, and then you're moving into short stories and things, a letter or whatever, and then you're moving into interpretation. So I'm just going to draw another arrow here. Interpretation. So that's critical literacies. And again, I've got a video on that one, so watch that one. In high school, we spend a lot of time, yes, on creating new things, but also in interpreting text and understanding why authors do things the way they do, what decisions they made, why they made those decisions, what effect that has, how they could have written that sentence differently, why that image was used, what effect that image has because it's from a certain angle or because it's got a certain coloured lens on it, a yellowish lens as opposed to, and so on.